On a quiet October afternoon in 1999, a 10-year-old girl named Pamela Butler laced up her rollerblades and stepped outside to enjoy the last rays of daylight. She never made it back home. In broad daylight, just steps from her front door in Kansas City, Kansas, a stranger in a white pickup truck was watching, waiting. Her younger sister witnessed the nightmare unfold. Helpless as Pamela was, yanked off the street and thrown into the vehicle. The man behind the wheel was Keith Dwayne Nelson, a drifter with a disturbing past and an even darker plan. What followed would spark a manhunt that crossed state lines and stunned an entire nation. But this wasn't his first brush with violence, and what the public would learn about his intentions was chilling. This is a story of grief and justice, of a community shattered and a mother's quiet strength in the face of unimaginable loss. It's also a story about how the federal justice system reawakened after a 17-year pause to make sure the name Keith Nelson would never haunt another family again. Stay with us, because what happened after Pamela disappeared is more disturbing than anyone imagined. Hey there and welcome, new and returning viewers to the channel. I'm so glad you're here. I started this true crime series with a big dream, to hit 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I know that's a tough goal, but with your help, I truly believe it's possible. Every time you watch a video to the end, leave a comment, hit like, or share it with someone. It really does make a difference. I'm here to bring you the most compelling, chilling, and deeply human stories. And I want this to be a space where we think, feel, and question together. So if you enjoy what you see, please consider subscribing and coming back for more. There's so much still to uncover. You're welcome to another episode of Crime Matinee, where we uncover the most haunting true crime stories and explore the darkest corners of human behavior while reflecting on the lessons they leave behind. Today's episode examines the heartbreaking case of Pamela Butler, a bright 10-year-old girl whose life was stolen in an act of unimaginable cruelty. Abducted in broad daylight, Pamela was later found murdered, a crime that shocked the entire nation. Who was the man behind this horrific act, and how was he finally brought to justice? Join us as we walk through the days leading up to her disappearance, the intense investigation that followed, and the chilling confession. This is the tragic story of Pamela Butler and the monster who stalked her. Keith Dwayne Nelson entered into the world on the 23rd of November in 1974 in Texas, an American state known for its sprawling landscapes, rugged individualism, and deep-rooted tensions between wealth and poverty. But Keith didn't enter into the grand myths of Texas. He entered into hardship from the very beginning. His life was already teetering on the edge. He was born prematurely, so he was fragile, underdeveloped, and exposed to medical vulnerabilities that would linger in the background of his life like shadows. In that era, long before widespread neonatal care became common in low-income communities, a premature birth often meant the child was set back physically, cognitively, and emotionally before they even had a chance. His family didn't have the resources to nurture him through these early complications, and that lack of care, of intervention, of stability echoed through every chapter of his life. He was one of 5 children in a home that was anything but safe. The Nelson household was not a place of refuge. It was a crucible of violence, emotional neglect, and psychological trauma. Keith's mother, Nancy Nelson, was herself overwhelmed and unequipped to care for her children, whether it was a lack of support or generational cycles of dysfunction. She left her children, especially Keith, to fend for themselves emotionally. His father, Kenneth Morse, was reportedly a tyrant in his own home, brutal, domineering, and physically abusive. Morse inflicted pain that left no room for tenderness. He didn't discipline, he battered. And Keith, barely old enough to understand what a father was supposed to be, learned instead that love came with fear. It got worse. Through court records and interviews, it would later be revealed that Keith had been sexually abused during his childhood, first by one of his mother's boyfriends, a man who should never have been near children. Then again, during his time in juvenile detention at just 14 years old. These were not just crimes against a child's body, they were fractures in the soul. They taught him early that trust was dangerous, that people took what they wanted, and that silence was safer than seeking help. During these years in the late 1970s and early 1980s, America was not yet having national conversations about trauma, mental illness, or child abuse in any serious way, especially in working class or impoverished communities. Such wounds were buried deep and left untreated. Boys were told to toughen up. Emotions were signs of weakness, and if you were struggling in school like Keith was, you were labeled a problem, not a person. Keith was diagnosed with dyslexia, and his inability to keep up in school further isolated him. He was bullied, so therefore he lashed out. He skipped class and eventually began failing altogether. No one stepped in with an individualized education plan. No counselors intervened, and in the eyes of the system, he was simply troubled. But beneath that label was a child quietly crumbling. He fought often. He broke rules. He learned that survival meant acting first, being harder, colder, and less vulnerable than the next kid. And in this warped emotional landscape, Keith began to internalize a dangerous worldview that violence was power, control was safety, and empathy was weakness. With his behavioral issues compounding and life reinforcing its lessons that no one would protect him, he just stopped caring. During the Reagan era, America is changing. There's a crackdown on crime, but not a response to the root causes of it. The foster care system was overflowing. Mental health facilities were being defunded, and bad kids were being funneled into punitive institutions instead of receiving therapy or support. Keith Nelson was a textbook case of a child molded by systemic failure. He wasn't rehabilitated, he was hardened. By the early 1990s, now an adult, he's still that same angry, isolated boy on the inside. The trauma had metastasized. He began racking up criminal charges, petty thefts, attempted escape from custody, disturbing behavior that hinted at deeper issues. He formed shallow relationships, including one with a girl named Carrie Dillion, who would later bear his child. Keith eventually moved to Missouri with his family, but geography didn't change his destiny. As he stumbled through early adulthood, he patched his life together through temporary and odd jobs here and there, sometimes unloading cargo or working odd labor gigs. He moved through life like a drifter, never settling, never rooting. But even then, he had the capacity to mask his intentions. Then he met a woman named Carrie Dillion and entered into a relationship with her, and together they had a son. Nelson even cared for her older child from a previous relationship. To outsiders, he might have looked like someone trying to turn things around, but that illusion wouldn't hold for long. For underneath, something far more sinister was quietly building. By September of 1999, Nelson had stopped hiding his darkest urges. In a chilling conversation with a co-worker at a staffing agency in Kansas City, he confessed that he wanted to kidnap a woman. Not just kidnap, he talked about torturing, killing, and burying her. He claimed he was already headed back to prison for unrelated crimes and figured if he was going back anyway, he might as well go big. The co-worker didn't call the police. Maybe they thought he was just joking. Maybe they didn't want to believe that someone could say something so horrific and mean it. But Keith Dwayne Nelson meant every word. For 10 days later, he attacked a woman named Mishan Matson. Another close call, another warning sign. He held a knife to her throat. He tried to drag her into his truck, and likely would have gone through with his plan had she not escaped. Again, he vanished into the background, escaping justice for a crime that should have set off every alarm. It's most chilling in hindsight to know how many times he could have been stopped. His life was screaming danger, but no one was listening loudly enough. By October 1999, Keith Dwayne Nelson wasn't just fantasizing about violence, he was now planning it. For days, he stalked the neighborhoods in the Kansas City area, his white pickup truck slowly prowling residential streets like a predator circling its prey. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for a victim. And according to investigators, he was clear about what he intended to do. He had told people, hinting at what he was going to do. He was boasting about it, but yet still, no one stopped him. Pamela, before her name became a headline, before she became a symbol of lost innocence and a call for justice, Pamela Irene Butler was simply a child full of life. Born on March 13, 1989, Pamela entered the world in Kansas City, Kansas, into the middle of a family full of love, strength, and resilience. Her mother, Sherry West, was raising several children, each unique, each cherished, and Pamela quickly stood out as the one with quiet fire in her eyes. From the beginning, she was observant, curious, and kind-hearted. She wasn't loud, but when she spoke, people listened. Pamela was the kind of child who made her mark gently. At Fisk Elementary School, where she was in 5th grade, she had already become known for her straight A's. Teachers described her as polite, attentive, and ambitious, someone who was eager to learn and always ready to help a classmate. She had dreams of growing up to do something that mattered, though exactly what that was changed depending on the week. Maybe a teacher, maybe a doctor. Her world was still full of possibility. She loved her family, especially her siblings. Her bond with her sister Penny, just a year older, was unbreakable. The two were often seen rollerblading together or riding bikes around their neighborhood, their laughter echoing down the sidewalks. They were more than sisters. They were best friends, partners in every childhood adventure. That closeness would be part of what made the tragedy so devastating. Penny had witnessed Pamela's abduction, and she would never be able to forget it. Pamela grew up in a working-class neighborhood, tight-knit, modest, and, at the time, safe enough that parents felt comfortable letting their kids play outside until the streetlights flicked on. The 1990s was still a time when the most serious threats felt distant, almost unimaginable. The local community was full of parents who looked out for one another's children. It was the kind of place where birthdays were shared, school events were well attended, and neighbors were extended family. In many ways, Pamela's upbringing was what every child deserves. It was supportive, structured, and rooted in love. Her mother worked hard to provide, and while life may not have been perfect, Pamela was surrounded by values that shaped her into a thoughtful and driven girl. She learned kindness by watching it. She learned courage by living it. There are no public records or reports indicating trauma or instability in Pamela's life. She wasn't a child in crisis. She was thriving. What makes her story so heartbreaking is that she was doing everything right. She had a strong family. She was excelling at school. She was enjoying her childhood on a bright October day, just rollerblading down her street when someone else's dark passed and darkness took all of it away. On October 12, 1999, the air was crisp with the first hints of fall. Children were playing outside, families winding down their day in a small Kansas City neighborhood. 10-year-old Pamela Butler had just returned from buying cookies with her sister. She strapped on her rollerblades and glided out in front of her house, free, unaware, completely innocent. Nelson was already watching. He parked near her home and left the passenger door of his truck slightly ajar. It was a trap, baited by opportunity. As Pamela skated past, he lunged, grabbing her, dragging her into the vehicle in front of her sister's horrified eyes. Penny Butler, just 11 years old, screamed for help, but Nelson had already slammed the door and sped away. In an act of cruel mockery, he even made a vulgar gesture at the screaming child through the rearview mirror, sealing a moment that would haunt her forever. The abduction happened in broad daylight. Witnesses rushed to write down the truck's license plate. The neighborhood erupted in panic, and within hours, the story hit local and national news. But by then, Nelson had already crossed state lines, heading towards Missouri. He drove for miles, eventually reaching a wooded area near a quiet church in Grain Valley, a place that should have symbolized peace, but became the backdrop for something unthinkable. The details of what happened in those woods are painful and difficult, but what's important to know is that Nelson carried out what he had planned. The crime was violent, methodical, and heartbreaking. When it was over, he left her there, hidden among the trees, discarded and alone. That night, a church custodian noticed Nelson's truck parked suspiciously in the lot. The next morning, after seeing news reports about the abduction and recognizing the vehicle, he and his wife alerted the authorities, but Nelson was already gone. The truck was found abandoned the next day, deepening the urgency of the manhunt. 2 days later, on October 14th, a civilian police employee spotted Nelson hiding beneath a bridge. When approached, Nelson bolted into the river in a desperate attempt to escape. It was futile. Railroad workers nearby caught up with him and held him down until police arrived. When asked where Pamela was, Nelson coldly replied that he knew, but he wouldn't say. That moment, broadcast live on television, chilled the community. The following day, police would discover Pamela's body in the woods behind the church. It was a moment that broke hearts and hardened resolve. Nelson's crime was not one of impulse. It was premeditated, deliberate, and executed with a frightening calm. He had attempted a similar crime just days earlier, attacking a medical student with a knife outside her apartment. She narrowly escaped, and long before that, he had spoken openly about wanting to commit a crime so horrific it would make his return to prison worth it. What set Nelson apart wasn't just the act itself, but the cold calculation behind it. He was not driven by passion or revenge. He was driven by control, by the desire to dominate, and by an emptiness that had devoured any trace of empathy long ago. The abduction and murder of Pamela Butler left an entire community in mourning and a nation stunned by the sheer audacity of evil that could unfold in broad daylight on a quiet suburban street. Pamela didn't live long enough to become who she would have been. Even at just 10 years old, she left an imprint. Friends remembered her smile. Classmates remembered her generosity. And her family, most of all, remembered a little girl who was full of light. In the years since her death, many have spoken of her as a symbol, but before that, she was just Pamela, a daughter, the sister, the student, the friend. And if the measure of a person is the love they leave behind, then Pamela's short life meant more than words can ever capture. The abduction of Pamela Butler wasn't a mystery that slowly unraveled. It was a race against time. The moment Keith Nelson sped away from that quiet neighborhood in Kansas City, Kansas, with 10-year-old Pamela Butler in his truck, the city was electrified with urgency. Pamela had vanished in broad daylight in front of multiple witnesses, including her own sister. The horror was not only immediate, it was visible, and in that instant, what had begun as an ordinary October afternoon on Scott Avenue became a nightmare that demanded a response from every level of law enforcement. The call came in quickly. Pamela had been taken around 4 p.m. that day. Neighbors and bystanders, jolted by what they had seen, acted fast. Multiple witnesses described the white pickup truck. One man even jumped into his own vehicle and tried to follow Nelson, but lost him in traffic. Fortunately, he had scribbled down something crucial: a Missouri license plate, 177-CE2. That single detail would become the cornerstone of the case. As the sun set that evening, the story of Pamela's abduction broke on local news channels. It wasn't long before her name and her photograph was circulating across state lines. The image of a smiling fifth grader in rollerblades struck a nerve. Communities were shaken, but behind the scenes, police were already building a dragnet. Nelson, unaware of just how many eyes were on him now, made a critical mistake. Later that same night, the custodian of the Green Valley Christian Church, located just across the Missouri border, spotted something unusual in the parking lot: a white pickup truck parked without explanation. His wife noted the vehicle had an Afghan blanket spread across the front seat. After seeing the 10 o'clock news and recognizing the description, they did what so many others don't. They called it in. When the police arrived, the truck was gone, but their tip had narrowed the map. By the morning of October 13, the pickup truck was found abandoned in Kansas City, Missouri. Inside the vehicle, police recovered critical evidence including fibers, fingerprints, and DNA that would later link the crime scene directly back to Nelson. The forensic trial was heating up. More importantly, detectives now had a confirmed identity. The registered owner of the truck was Keith Dwayne Nelson. Now it was personal. A multi-agency manhunt was launched. The FBI, local police departments, and regional task forces began combing through Nelson's known locations, his home, former workplaces, friends, and family connections. But he had vanished, but not for long. On the morning of October 14, 1999, just 2 days after the abduction, a civilian employee with the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department spotted something unusual near a bridge. A man, partially concealed, hiding in the brush. When she moved closer, he bolted, plunging into a nearby river in a desperate, panicked escape attempt. But this wasn't a movie. There was no escape. As Nelson swam toward the far shore, railroad workers on the opposite bank had already been alerted. They surrounded him as he emerged from the water, shivering and silent. Authorities arrived within minutes. TV crews already on high alert captured the arrest live. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a public exhale. The manhunt was over, but the search for Pamela wasn't. As Nelson was cuffed and placed in a patrol car, someone in the crowd shouted, "Where is the little girl?" Nelson turned to an officer and replied coldly, "I know where she's at, but I'm not saying right now." The next day, October 15th, investigators made a devastating discovery, acting on clues and tips gathered during the interrogation. They found Pamela Butler's body in a wooded area behind Grain Valley Christian Church. It was a heartbreaking end to the frantic search and a moment that would leave an entire region reeling. The U.S. Attorney's Office held a live press conference at the scene, a somber acknowledgement that justice would now begin its course. Forensics quickly confirmed what police already suspected. DNA recovered from Pamela's clothing matched Keith Nelson's. There was no room for doubt. The case was airtight. Nelson was charged on October 21st under federal law since he had taken Pamela across state lines. This elevated the crime to federal jurisdiction under the Federal Kidnapping Act, paving the way for what would eventually become a death penalty case. The speed and precision with which authorities pursued Nelson was more than just effective. It was a testament to what happens when a community, its witnesses, and its law enforcement agencies respond together swiftly and relentlessly. Nelson was caught in less than 48 hours, but what he took in those moments, the life of a vibrant 10-year-old girl, would ripple through years of grief, trials, and ultimately justice. When Keith Nelson was captured on the 14th of October 1999, the community hoped justice would be swift. What followed instead was a legal saga, a lengthy legal saga that stretched across years, spanning courtrooms, appeals, and one of the most emotionally charged federal trials of its time. October 21st. Federal charges are filed against Keith, and he's charged with kidnapping resulting in death, which is a federal capital offense because he had taken Pamela across state lines from Kansas to Missouri. It fell under the Federal Kidnapping Act, which carried the possibility of the death penalty. Secondly, he was charged with transporting a minor across state lines for the purpose of sexual abuse, which also resulted in death. At this stage, Nelson entered an initial plea of not guilty, and his defense filed for a change of venue, citing intense media coverage in the Kansas City area. This motion triggered months of procedural wrangling, including the collection of detailed questionnaires from 538 potential jurors, an unusually high number, underscoring the case's notoriety. In April 2000, prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty due to the severity and brutality of the crime. Federal prosecutors made it clear that they would push for the ultimate punishment. The death penalty was back on the table after a long federal hiatus, and Nelson would soon become the face of its return. On the 25th of October in 2001, in a shocking twist, after 2 years of pre-trial motions and mental health evaluations, Keith Nelson stormed the courtroom by pleading guilty to 1 count of kidnapping, resulting in death, as part of a plea agreement. Prosecutors dropped the charge related to sexual assault in exchange for his guilty plea. However, this didn't spare him, because under federal law, the conviction of kidnapping resulting in death alone carried a possible death sentence. Days later, Nelson was hospitalized after a suicide attempt. He had ingested a large quantity of antidepressants, an act the defense would later reference as evidence of his unstable mental health. After recovering, he returned to court to face sentencing. The jury was tasked with the ultimate question: life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. The defense presented a case rooted in Nelson's damaged childhood, his premature birth, abusive home, sexual victimization, dyslexia, and mental illness. They painted him not as a monster, but as a man broken from birth, shaped by trauma that no one ever helped him confront. But the prosecution didn't flinch. They argued that Nelson's actions had obliterated any claim to mercy. Pamela had been targeted, taken, and killed in a calculated act of cruelty. And though Nelson's past was tragic, it was not unique. His siblings, also raised in the same household, had gone on to live honest, law-abiding lives. On the 28th of November, the jury had reached its verdict. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with an unanimous recommendation: death. The swiftness of their decision spoke volumes. In their eyes, no amount of pain in Nelson's past could justify what he had done. They saw the crime for what it was: cold, premeditated, and irreversible. On the 11th of March, 2002, is the official sentencing hearing. United States District Judge Gaishan formally sentenced Keith Dwayne Nelson to death by lethal injection. In court, Nelson showed no remorse. Instead, he lashed out at the judge and Pamela's family with a profanity-laced tirade. It was a final act of defiance that only further hardened the perception of who he truly was. Over the next 18 years, Nelson would file numerous appeals and motions, each one denied, however. The courts consistently upheld the jury's decision, rejecting arguments around venue bias, jury selection, and ineffective counsel. His legal journey would take him to the steps of the US Supreme Court, but never through the door. It was on the 27th of August in 2020, almost 18 years after his sentencing, just one day before his execution. The judge blocked the proceedings on the basis of a violation of regulations by the federal protocol. However, a higher court swiftly overturned it, and the path was cleared for his execution. That night, Nelson vomited repeatedly in his cell. According to fellow inmates, he was overwhelmed, not from the fear of death, but from the intensity of the moment. On the 28th of August, in 2020, at 4:32 p.m., Keith Dwayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection. A single dose of pentobarbital was administered, and he was pronounced dead 9 minutes later. He offered no final statement, no apology, no explanation. Witnesses observed the execution from behind glass. Among them was Cherry West, Pamela's mother, who had waited over 20 years for this moment. She later said she never expected an apology. She remembered how during sentencing, Nelson had unleashed a torrent of profanity at her family. Showing no remorse. "I have no remorse for him," she said afterward. None. Inside the chamber, standing quietly beside Nelson, was Sister Barbara Batista, a Roman Catholic nun who opposed the death penalty but believed no one should die alone. She held her hands together in silent prayer, offering Nelson the only gesture of peace he would receive in these final moments. Keith Nelson became the 5th person executed by federal government in 2020 as part of what would become a controversial wave of federal executions during the final year of Donald Trump's presidency. In total, 13 men, including Keith Nelson, were executed in just 6 months. This was more than the previous 56 years combined under federal jurisdiction. But for the family of Pamela Butler, it wasn't about politics. It was about the life of a bright, sweet 10-year-old girl who went out to buy cookies and never came home. It was about the wound left behind in a community and the long, slow process of justice. Painful, imperfect, but finally finished. In the end, justice caught up with Keith Nelson, but not before a little girl's life was stolen far too soon. Pamela Butler's story is more than a tragedy. It's a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how fiercely it must be protected. Behind every headline is a human life, and behind every act of violence is a chain of missed chances to intervene. Evil doesn't start with a crime. It starts with neglect, silence, and a world that looks the other way. But from darkness, truth can rise, and with it, the power to change, to guard, to listen. May we honor Pamela, not just by remembering how she died, but by committing to protect those who still live. Because the measure of a society isn't just how it punishes its monsters, it's how it protects its children. So we've come to the end of another chilling episode on Crime Matinee. If you liked it and you would like to see more of this content, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, share your thoughts and leave comments for me, and let me know what you thought about this video. It's a relatively new channel. We're trying to grow our subscribers, so please subscribe to our growing fan base so we can make the 5,000 subscriber mark. Your subscription is appreciated. Turn on the notification bell so you'll be notified whenever I drop a new video. See you in my next post.